So here we are, Drive Electric Earth Day 2021. Blue Ridge EV Club in Western North Carolina region is the sponsor for this event, and as well as the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy. And this photo is taken of Dave Erb doing a talk outside at Solar Alliance for Clean Energy in Asheville. And they have an array and a number of charging stations here. So Dave Erb is going to introduce himself right now, and I'll let him take over. Let me stop the share. Go ahead, Dave.
And Joe showed you a picture of the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy's panels, which I'm actually going to talk about in a little while towards the end. But this is Joe's house and car in this picture. I'm Dave Erb. I've spent 40 years as an automotive engineer. I'm retired now, but I started my career as a test and development engineer in the heavy truck and transit bus industry. I spent most of my career as a college professor. I taught engineering by day and business by moonlight at a number of schools. And I had a little stint with a consulting practice in the middle of all of that. But the whole time, my main focus has been on fuel economy and emissions. I've developed vehicles with most of the fuels you've heard of. I've done studies on probably all of them you've heard of, and a few you may not have. But what I learned in doing that is that I really needed to specialize on electric and hybrid electric vehicles. So for the last 25 years ago, I've pretty much worked almost exclusively with EVs and HEVs. My wife and I live in a totally electric house in Asheville, North Carolina. We have 6 kilowatts of solar panels on the roof. Over the course of a year, those panels generate as much electricity as the house consumes, with enough left over to drive our 2 electric cars about 6,000 miles a year. And so this past year with the pandemic, we were actually at net zero for house and cars, but hopefully we're going to get to start traveling again, and that won't be true anymore. So it's a work in progress. It'll probably be a work in progress for a long time. It's actually my life's work to drive on sunshine. I've written about that work. Driving to Net Zero is a book that was pulled together by Dave Frivnak, who's another member of the Blue Ridge EV Club. It has 15 chapters. They're all first-person accounts of families that have combined electric vehicles, solar houses, and other sustainability strategies. And I had the privilege of writing chapter 1. It's available on Amazon. We represent 14 chapters in the US and 1 more in Canada. I had the privilege of writing chapter 1. It's available on Amazon, but if you live close enough to Asheville, I'll sell it to you for $10 less than Amazon does. And if it's really close to Asheville, I'll even deliver it for free in a solar-powered electric car. Today, what I want to talk about is the steps we need to take to make our transportation system sustainable. I want to talk about the basics of solar power and of using that to charge EVs. But mainly what I want to talk about is whatever you want to talk about. The formal presentation should last about 35 minutes. And then we're going to have Q&A for whatever time we have left. And I'll stay as long as we have a connection. Please send questions to Joe, as he already mentioned, and his address is questions for presenter on the chat function. Excuse me. So again, I've worked in this field for 40 years. I've looked at reams and reams of data, and I think it's crystal clear that if we're going to continue to enjoy the benefits that we have from our present transportation system, we're going to sustain those benefits, we need to do 4 things. As North Americans, we need to do 4 things. First, we need to reduce our demand for motorized travel. There are lots of ways to do that. You can live closer to your work. You can do Zoom meetings instead of in-person meetings. But we need to replace a lot of our motion with forethought, is really the gist of that first step. Second, we need to use our vehicles more productively when we do put them on the road. Again, there's lots ways to do it, but they all boil down to doing a better job of matching the vehicles to their loads than we presently do in North America. You can downsize the vehicles to match the loads, but you can also consolidate loads to more completely fill vehicles. Carpooling is a perfect example of that second step. Third thing we need to do is to electrify the vehicle powertrains to the maximum extent that's feasible. There's three levels of electrification. There's charge-sustaining hybrids like Priuses. They're really gasoline-fueled vehicles, but they use electric components to burn the gas more cleanly and more efficiently. There's plug-in hybrids that are both gas-fueled vehicles and electrically energized vehicles. And then there's fully battery electric vehicles, which are pure electric vehicles. They're powered off of grid electricity. We need to take that as far as is reasonable. And that extent to which electrification makes sense is going to be dictated not by the vehicle, but by the mission we want it to perform. And since most of those missions are actually going to lend themselves to plug-in levels of electrification, we need to use as much renewable energy on the grid as we can. We need to basically transition the grid to completely renewable electricity. I'm going to argue pretty vehemently that we should be emphasizing distributed photovoltaics. 1,000 houses spread throughout the grid, each with 5 kilowatts of solar on the roof, is a lot better than 5 megawatts in a centralized solar farm. And the utilities are going to be pushing for the centralized thing, but we need to be pushing for policy that encourages the distributed system with user-owned systems. These steps are all valid. They're all positive steps that represent progress. You can take them in any order and you've done a good thing. You can take them individually or together and you've done a good thing. So there is not a correct order for taking these steps. If you can take one of these steps, you should take one of these steps. However, to the extent that there might be a correct order, I've listed it here. This is to the extent that there might be a correct order, this is it. The sustainability mantra says conservation first, technology second. That's how you get the most bang for your buck. And the first two steps are pure conservation steps. Vehicle electrification is a conservation step first. Electrified vehicles consume a lot less primary energy than combustion vehicles do. That's taking it all the way back to the field, wherever you got primary energy in the first place. But they're also a technology step that shifts us to other ways of doing things. Renewable electricity is a pure technology step. And this slide, I have this slide up here, this second version of this, because there are voices out there who will tell you that you should not buy a plug-in vehicle until you've put solar on your roof, that there is a different order here. There are actually extremist voices out there, a few, who will tell you that even after you put solar on your roof, you shouldn't buy a plug-in vehicle until the whole grid has been converted to renewable electricity. These folks are wrong. And these folks are not stupid. They're intelligent people, they're well-educated people, they're well-respected people. Many of them have quite a prominent platform, but they're wrong. And so one thing I didn't say, I intend to say some things that might stimulate some argument. Please send Joe in the chat a question. If you disagree with what I'm saying, give me a chance to justify these statements I'm making. I also intend to talk a little bit fast. So if I blaze through something faster than you'd like, ask me to go back to it through Joe's chat, questions for presenter. So again, your next car, if you care about the things that I care about, public health, air pollution, greenhouse gases, energy security, the cost of energy, things like that, then your next car should have a plug on it. And it doesn't matter if you put the solar on on your roof yet. We tend to talk about solar power and solar energy somewhat interchangeably, and they are intimately related. But for the things we're going to talk about today, it's kind of important to make a distinction between power and energy. They're intimately related, but they are not the same thing. And that difference does matter in today's discussion. So energy is the ability to do work. And engineers like me have a very precise, very mathematical definition of what work is. You don't need to know about that. If you don't know what that is, it doesn't matter. If you were trying to do something with your muscles and it would cause you to sweat, I guarantee you there is work involved. We measure both work and energy in joules. Again, it doesn't really matter if you don't understand how big a joule is or exactly what it is. Just understand we measure distance in inches and feet and furlongs and meters and things like that. Joules is one unit we use to measure energy and work. Whenever we do work, we are transferring energy. And so sometimes, most of the time actually, it matters how fast we're doing that work. The time frame is not necessarily infinite. We need to get things done in a finite time. And so if I take the energy transfer, which is also the work being done, and I divide it by the time it took to do it, that's power. It's a rate at which I'm doing work. It's a rate at which I'm transferring energy. And we measure power in watts. 1 joule of work or 1 joule of energy transfer in 1 second is 1 watt. The way I would suggest you think about this, if this is new to you, is, and think of energy as this thing. Think of it like the water in a lake. And you would measure that in gallons or liters or pounds or something like that. Those correspond to what joules are. But if you're going to use that water to put out a fire, it matters whether you're using a squirt gun or a fire truck to pump that water out. And so a watt is analogous to gallons per hour, liters per second, something like that, a rate at which you're pumping that water out. It's not the thing you're pumping, it's the rate at which you're pumping it. When you plug your cell phone in, you're putting energy into the battery at a rate that's a couple of watts. I don't know the exact number because that's not my world. 1,000 watts is a kilowatt. If you look at the engine on your lawnmower, it might be 4 horsepower. Well, 4 horsepower is 3 kilowatts. They're just different ways of saying the same thing. So if that lawnmower was running full tilt, full throttle, working as hard as it possibly can, it's doing the work of cutting your grass at a rate of 3 kilowatts. 1,000 kilowatts is a megawatt. If you have a full-scale diesel locomotive that's running at full throttle, trying to pull a train up a really steep hill, then it's doing work somewhere in the realm of 3 megawatts, about 4,000 horsepower. And then 1,000 megawatts is a gigawatt. A modern nuclear power plant generates electricity at the rate of about 1 gigawatt. Now, it's really hard to measure electrical energy, but it's fairly easy to measure electrical power. So the utility, instead of trying to measure energy, which is what they sell you, they measure your power and then they multiply it by the time you drew that power. So if power is energy divided by time, then energy must be power times time. So what they measure is the number of kilowatts you're drawing, and they multiply it by the number of hours you drew it, and that gives them an amount of energy in kilowatt hours. So both joules and kilowatt hours are measures of energy. It's just different sets of units. And so it's kind of analogous to both inches and meters are measures of distance. Joules and kilowatt hours are the same thing. It's just a different unit for measuring it. So why does this matter? I mean, this is not a totally academic discussion here. When you talk about your car, the kilowatts, the power, dictate dynamic performance. So your acceleration, you've seen all these videos of Tesla's drag racing with muscle cars and winning. That has a lot to do with how much power is on board the vehicle. It has to do with some other things too, but so your acceleration, your top speed, your gradability, which is not only the steepness of the slope that you can climb, but also how fast you can climb a given steepness, your towing capability, those are all very closely related to the power, the kilowatts that are on board. Your kilowatt hours are your energy that's on board, and that's your range, basically. People will brag about their car has better, goes farther, it has longer range because it has better battery technology, but really isn't about better battery technology. It's about the fact that the batteries are bigger. If you tell me how many pounds the battery pack weighs or how many kilograms mass it has, I can give you a pretty daggone good estimate of the range of that vehicle. It's the energy corresponds to the weight, and so you tell me how big the battery is, I can tell you how far that car is going to go within a pretty close approximation. When it comes to PV, to the photovoltaic panels, the solar panels, we buy them on the basis of power. My rooftop system has 21 panels, but it matters how big each one is. Each of those panels is rated at 285 watts. And so the total system is very close to 6,000 watts. So I just call it a 6 kilowatt system. The unit that we buy of a solar panel is in watts. And pretty much every solar installation has some level of customization in it. And so when you get quotes from different installers, they're not all going to be identical. The first way that I would use to compare the different quotes would be in terms of how many dollars did I have to spend per watt. I would take the total turnkey price of the system that includes all the balance of system parts like the racking, the wiring, the inverter, the safety cutoff switches and things like that. I would, and all the installation labor, and I would say, how many dollars was that and how many watts of power did I get? And I'd look at that dollars per watt figure as the first thing I'd look at when I'm comparing quotes from different installers. A cheaper system isn't necessarily, a less expensive system is not necessarily the best bargain if it's costing you more per watt. Now, obviously, if it's the middle of the night, my 285 watt panel on my roof is producing 0 watts. So there must be some way that we've had of deciding that it's a 285 watt panel. And there is. There are standard test conditions used to establish the watt rating of the panel. They basically boil down to full noontime sun at sea level, hitting the panel square on. So the panel is facing directly at the sun. It's a cloudless day. It's a little bit cooler day than the summer, maybe what you'd see in the spring or the fall. And that matters because the hotter the panel gets, the less the output is. It does go down with heat, with temperature. But we rate these panels based on that set of standard conditions, which are basically full noontime sun. So we buy the panels on the basis of power, watts, but we buy them because we want energy, kilowatt hours. And so we need some measure of time to get from power to energy. And you can't just take the length of the day and multiply that number of hours by the rating of the panel and get the output. It doesn't work that way because the rating is based on the sun hitting the panel right square on. The rating is based on no clouds in the sky. When you wake up in the morning, the sun is coming at the panel, basically hitting the side. It's really not hitting the panel. It gets more and more hitting the panel as the day goes on. And then once it gets past noon, it starts receding again. So what we do is we take the total amount of light that hit the panel in the course of the entire day or week or year or whatever time frame we're interested in, and we say how many hours of that full noontime sun would have had to have hit the panel to get the same amount of light on the surface of the panel. And so we talk in terms of full sun hours. And the National Renewable Energy Laboratory then has tabulated that amount. It depends on where you are, because it not only depends on just the latitude and such, but it also depends on how cloudy is it where you are. It's very different in Portland than it is in Asheville, just because of the cloud cover. And so NREL has tabulated this information. It also depends on the orientation of the panels. Are the panels sitting on a flat roof facing straight up? Are they tilted up towards the sun? Are they facing east? Are they facing west? Are they on a tracker that follows the sun through the day? Those things matter, but NREL has tabulated it for all sorts of varying orientations, and also for all sorts of different geographic locations. And you can get it in tabular form, but it's much easier to use if you just go to a calculator they've created. It's called PV Watts. It's at the URL that's shown there. And you go to PV Watts, you type in your zip code, and then you type in some data about your system, and it will spit out a month-by-month estimate of what you would see in terms of energy production from your system. And it's based on historic weather data. So it's not just looking at the best possible day, the worst possible day. It's looking at the historic average of how much cloud cover there is and things like that. Now, personally, I like to make a few quick back-of-the-envelope rule of thumb calculations before I even go to something as useful and easy to use as PV Watts, the calculator. So I would like to make a quick assessment of what my production is going to be to get an idea of how big my system is before I start trying to specify a system to PV Watts. So for folks who are near Asheville, I actually have some really good data. I have a system on my roof. It's been up there for 6 years, and I watch it pretty closely. And what I know is that it has produced an output of 8,600 kilowatt hours per year on average. So I'll divide it. It's a 6 kilowatt system. I'll divide 8,600 kilowatt hours by 6 kilowatts. And I'll find out that, and then I'll round down because I'm a conservative guy. I don't like unpleasant surprises. So I'll round the number I get down to 1,400 full sun hours per year. It's ranged from 1,570 down to 1,360. Obviously, that 1,570 was a bit of an anomaly because the average has been 1,400, much closer to the minimum. And one benefit of this, when you're using NREL's data, you have to specify not only the full sun hours, but you need, and then the rating of your panels, but you also need to toss in an efficiency number to account for the losses in the balance of system, in the wires and the inverter and the DC optimizers and that stuff. That's already built into my number because these are empirical numbers, they're measured numbers. This is what actually got produced by my system. So those inefficiencies are already worked into here. The other thing I need to look at is what's my car consuming? And the way to get that is to go to the EPA's website called fueleconomy.gov. And if you look in there for the plug-in vehicles, both battery electric and plug-in hybrid, the best vehicle in the 2021 listing consumes 240 watt hours per mile. The worst vehicle consumes 800 watt hours per mile. And most of them are actually fairly close to 300. The 800 is a very much an outlier. But you can go in there and you can look up your car's consumption and get a number that's the EPA number. And it's probably not going to be exactly what you get with your car. Nobody is the average driver. We're all either above or below average. But it'll be the best estimate to compare to other cars if you're shopping, for example. And it's the best one to use if you don't know for sure anything else. So I will also warn you about one thing. The EPA uses a different unit than I do. They use kilowatt hours per 100 miles. So they're dividing by 1,000, dividing the number I would use by 1,000 and multiplying it by 100. So they're off by a factor of 10 compared to what I do. So when you go to fueleconomy.gov, take the number they show and multiply it by 10, and that will convert it into the units that I'm using, watt hours per mile instead of kilowatt hours per 100 miles. So here's how you use those numbers. You've got a typical electric car that consumes 300 watt hours per mile. You've got 1,400 full sun hours per year with the full-blown, including the inefficiencies version here in Asheville. And so you take 300 watt hours per mile and you divide it by 1,400 full sun hours per year, and it says, I need about a fifth to a quarter of a watt for every mile that I want to drive per year. So the average American drives about 1,000 miles a month. And so that's 12,000 miles a year. I multiply that by 0.22, and I find out that I need a system that's about 2,700 watts in order to provide all the energy that car would consume over the course of a year, or over the course of many years, the 30 years that you're going to have the system on your roof. So for my panels, I've got 285 watts a panel. So this would be about 10 of my panels would be required to drive 12,000 miles a year. Another question that comes up a lot with solar is what's it cost? And that has a variation. Sometimes people ask, what's the payback period? I really don't like, I taught business by moonlight, and I really hate payback period as a figure of merit. So I use something different. But what it costs, the best estimate I can give you is it's going to cost you about $2.75 a watt. When you go and you compare installers these days and you get the total installed turnkey price, that's a pretty good ballpark for where that price should come in for most of the systems we're going to be looking at. It's more if you have a small system. It could be less if you have a bigger system. If you use really premium components, it might be higher. If you use the cheapest possible components, it might be lower. But that's a good ballpark number, $2.75 a watt. Instead of doing payback period, what I do is I do discounted cash flow analysis. So I make the assumption going in that I'm going to put the cost of this system into my mortgage. And as a result, I'm not going to see any big slug of outgo when I buy a system. I'm going to see a series of 360 monthly payments in my mortgage that are going to be a little bit higher because I have solar included in it. And they're going to be offset by 360 utility bills that are going to be a little lower because I have solar on my roof. So mortgage money right now is it's actually under, last time I checked, it's under 3% for a 30-year mortgage. So I just use 3% because, again, I like to be a little conservative. There is a utility buy down here in North Carolina. Duke Energy, anyway, has one. The co-ops and munis don't. But I zeroed it because, frankly, it's at this stage of the game, it's so heavily subscribed, it sells out within the first hour or so that it's available online on the first business day in January. Your odds of getting it this year are almost nil. And so, in fact, your odds of getting it for 2021 are zero. And even for 2022, your odds are low. So I haven't included it. The federal tax credit just got increased. It was set to drop and eventually phase out. It's still going to phase out, but we got a little bit of a reprieve. It's 26% for this year and next year. So 6% of the value of the system, the installed cost of the system, is will come back to you as a tax credit. It's not a deduction, it's a credit. It comes right off the top of the taxes that you owe, and you can extend it over multiple years. If you don't have enough tax liability in the first year, you can extend it to second and beyond until you have consumed it. There's probably some limit, but I don't know how many years it is. North Carolina doesn't have a state tax credit anymore, so I don't have that zero. I have that zeroed, but with the federal tax credit, $2.75 a watt becomes $2.04 a watt here. My electricity price is 10.6 cents a kilowatt hour. These numbers here, the 4.9 full sun hours and the 0.75 D-rate factor, that's to account for inefficiency. This would give you a number like that 1,400 full sun hours. It's actually a little more conservative than that, but that's the way I programmed this spreadsheet. But anyway, when I look at that, I get a string of higher mortgage payments and lower utility bills. And then what I do is I use that same interest rate to pull that all back to what they're worth today. With just, if it was one transaction made today, what would that transaction be worth? And what I find is that it's about 74 cents per watt positive. So this is about $0.75. What this is saying is my 6,000 watt system financially is just like if somebody came up and handed me $4,500 cash on the day I threw the switch. That's the net financial effect of that system. Now, if I'm going to use that system to provide electricity for an EV, it gets even better. That system works out to equivalent of buying gas at $2.62 a gallon. But electric vehicles use energy so much more effectively and efficiently than gasoline vehicles do that I really need to consider that. So what I've said here is my typical electric vehicle is going to use about 300 watt hours per mile. A good hybrid like a Prius gets 50 miles per gallon. So I look at those two numbers because nobody's going to trade a Hummer on a Leaf, right? They're going to trade a Prius on a Leaf. So I need to be honest with myself here. I can't look and use this number at 15 miles per gallon or 12 or whatever a Hummer gets and be honest. So when I compare trading in my Prius and buying a Leaf, I find out that this solar investment is like locking in gas for that Prius for 30 years at $1.17 a gallon. It's a slam dunk financially. If I were trading in a typical American car, gets about 25 miles per gallon, so it's getting about half the miles per gallon. That it's using about twice the energy that the Prius does. This number here would come out to be what is that, 60 cents a gallon. So just, it's a slam dunk financially to go this route, to use solar to power your EV. We had a really interesting question in the registrations. Kathleen, I hope she's here, asked, could she make her PV array portable because she doesn't plan to live in her house forever? She'd like to take the PV array with her. And the answer to that is yes, you could, but don't. I was a college professor and I advised a lot of senior projects. And I guarantee you, if you put 5 teams of college students in competition with each other to design a way to make your PV array break down and be portable, you would, one of them, and all you'd have to do is dangle, like you'll buy them all pizza for the winning team. You could find that at least one of those teams would come up with something that was so creative, it would boggle your mind. But don't do it. For one thing, no matter how well they do that job, folding up that PV array to get it as small as it can be, it's still going to be incredibly bulky. It's going to take you a truck to carry it around, just the PV array. And as a person who has moved a lot in his life, you don't want the hassle of doing that. The other reason not to do it is you'd be leaving a lot of money on the table. Until fairly recently, when you would ask Angie's List or these other places, what does solar do to the value of my house? The answer from any honest source would be, we don't know. There's just not, there weren't enough data out there for anybody to draw a conclusion. That has changed now. There are enough systems out there that you can draw legitimate conclusions that are statistically defensible. And Lawrence Berkeley Lab has been the main one that's been doing those analyses. But there are also private websites. This particular one I have not used, but it was used by an installer that was given quotes to a family member. And so I don't know much about that site, but I thought I would at least add it. But Lawrence Berkeley Lab, the data I've seen says that say that the PV adds about $4 a watt typically to the selling price of your house. Well, it only costs you $2 a watt to put it up there in the first place after you consider the tax credit. So if I were in the business of flipping houses, which I'm not, I'd be looking for houses that I could easily mount solar on the roof because I double that piece of my investment, bang, right off the bat. So anyway, don't leave that money on the table. If you renovate your kitchen, you might spend 30 grand, but it might not add a nickel to the price of your house. But PV adds more to the value of the selling price of your house than it costs you. So we're now at a point where we're about to go to Q&A. Here's my contact information, and this really is my life's work. And being a retired guy, I don't get to do this work as much as I'd like. I would love to hear from you. I will warn you, if you call me, if you've got a simple thing like you just want a copy of my spreadsheet, my financial spreadsheet, sure, by all means, email me or text me or something like that. But if you want to discuss something that has any nuance to it at all, I'd really prefer a phone call, but be aware that you will have to go to voicemail probably and tell me who you are and why you're calling me. I don't answer calls from numbers I don't recognize. The other thing I want to comment on is we showed you that picture of the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy's solar array in downtown Asheville. I blog about EVs for SACE, and you can find there's 9 posts up so far. There's 4 on charging, and there's 5 on a lot of the misinformation that's out there. You can find those posts by going to the SACE website, cleanenergy.org, and there's a search line at the site. If you enter Daver EV, you'll find all 9 of those. And the other thing I want to encourage, if you're near Asheville, those 4 chargers, they have 4 level 2 chargers that are right beside that array, and they have sufficient electric service that all 4 cars can be plugged in at once and get 7+ kilowatts, so about 30 miles an hour of range replenishment. And so it's not only very convenient parking to downtown and a great charging location, it's free if you're a member of SACE. So please consider joining the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy and becoming a charging member. Just on the website, it's cleanenergy.org/charging to learn about that. So Joe, what do we got in the way of questions?
Okay, well, I think that thanks very much, Dave, for your presentation, for preparing it and delivering it in such a nice way. The last tip that you gave might have been worth the price of admission right there for this meeting. I did have, though, comments from Sharon, who I guess is in Northwest Florida, and she says appraisers currently give no value to the value of a house for additional solar. So I think it would really depend on where you are located. I'm sure some of the stats in California might be quite a bit different, where people are looking for that. Other places, they don't even know what that thing is on the house. They think it's more maintenance or something like that.
Yeah, and let me add one piece to that. My niece just bought a house, and in her soon-to-be new neighborhood, solar is a mixed bag, because if there are a lot of solar, there's a lot of solar that's on roofs with third-party arrangements where it's basically a long-term lease with no upfront cost. The solar installer installs it and just charges you a monthly fee that's based on the output. So they become kind of your little mini power company on your roof. And those are a mixed bag. That if you're looking at a house that has that on it, it actually can lower the cost the selling price of the house because people don't want to deal with the complexity of that contract.
Okay. Someone asked, is your house connected to Duke Energy? And I think this might be a good place to note whether about net metering, if you want to talk about that a minute.
Yeah. Yes, the answer is I'm Duke Energy Progress West. So for people who are familiar with the Carolinas electric situation, it's an investor-owned utility. And generally throughout the country, the investor-owned utilities are subject to much greater oversight by the utilities commissions. And so they tend to have more consistent arrangements, but there are a lot of different arrangements for how you might be credited with your production. In the case of Duke Energy, we have what I think is a fairly good, it's fair to both parties, net metering arrangements. So if you think of an old school electric meter that had the little spinning wheel that you could see, it spun faster when you were using more electricity. Net metering is a situation where, at least conceptually, you could spin that backwards when you're exporting power to the grid, and it spins forward when you're importing power from the grid. And so it nets out. And that's not how they do it. They do it with digital meters, but that's the same basic idea. You get a net consumption for a month or a net production for a month. Other places, the munis and the co-ops are a little more random, I guess is not quite the right word, but there's a lot more variation in the way they deal with on-grid solar. Some of them, and it really frustrates me a little bit because the rural co-ops in particular, the EMCs, they really could benefit greatly, probably the most of any utilities, by having their customers own solar out, and for a variety of reasons. It enhances their power quality and it enhances their reliability. It does a lot of things for them. It lowers their cost of energy because they're purchasers in the wholesale markets. But anyway, the co-ops and the munis are all over the map in what their arrangement is. But the beauty of both of those is they're owned by their ratepayers. The munis are basically government functions, and the rural co-ops are owned by the people who are their customers. So you have some influence with them if you have the energy to use it. Oh, there are also other arrangements. There's buy all, sell all, where you have 2 meters, and so the utility is measuring what goes out and what comes in separately. My meter here is bidirectional. The 1 meter is measuring both of those things. But usually with buy all, sell all, you're receiving a much reduced price. In the past, it's been useful, it's been beneficial because you also might be getting credit for the renewable energy credits, which used to be quite valuable, but now they're actually not worth that much.
Okay. So what Dave is basically saying is what most of us do. We're connected to a utility, we're grid connected, and we can do that because if our state has a net metering law, and if the Public Utility Commission allows that. One question in the chat asked about switching utilities, but usually we don't have those options. So you have to really investigate that for your specific area.
Yeah, very few places do have retail choice, but they're few and far between.
Yeah. Okay, I want to get this out of the way. It's a simple question, and a lot of people want to know, why can't I just put a solar panel on top of my car? So the question was really,
you asked that question. I actually had a slide for this and decided, in the interest of time, not to include it in the formal part of the presentation. But here's that slide. I have 2 battery electric vehicles. They both have license plates that misspell solar car. Somebody beat me to the correct spelling. And I did that to stimulate conversation. I wanted to talk about the nexus between solar and PV and EV. And it works. I get a lot of comments on it. Most of the time, people come up and say, where are the panels? On one of my cars, my Tesla Model 3, they sometimes mistake the panoramic roof for a solar panel. Occasionally, people will even be a little confrontational. They'll say, your car's not a solar car. It doesn't have any solar panels on it. But regardless, it gives me the chance to say, my solar panels are where solar panels belong. They're on the roof of my house. So every time I hit a pothole in my car, they are not being subjected to a life-shortening shock. The shock and vibration environment of a car is really difficult. It's really tough. You got to have rugged equipment to carry it around with you. And so by being on the roof, they're not subject to that. By being on the roof, they're sitting still. They're not forcing me to use extra energy to haul them around with me. And the engineer who built the car did not have to deal with the hassle of packaging them and adding extra structure to the car to support them and things like that. By sitting on my roof, they're never in the shade. If I park under a tree, if I've got the panels on my car, they're shaded. They're also never suboptimally oriented. They're always facing the direction I prefer them to face. And besides being on my roof, they're on the grid. They're connected to the grid. And that's important because if they're dedicated to the car, the output from those panels has to stop when the batteries get full. So if I want to use those panels to their optimum capability, I need a place for the electricity to go when the batteries on my car are full. So I'm really strongly opposed to the notion of photovoltaic panels on vehicles. I worked with some students who built solar cars of the sort you see in these two pictures. And it's really cool to race from Indianapolis to Denver at 60 miles an hour with the power of a hair dryer. That's really an interesting engineering exercise. It's incredibly educational. It's hard work, but it's fun. But they're crummy cars. They're terrible cars. They're flimsy. They break every time you hit the wrong pothole because they got to be so super light. They're hot because they're really cramped. You always take the tiniest woman on your team as your driver, but it's kind of like getting a jockey for a horse race. Nobody else will fit in it. And it's cramped and it's hot and they're just terrible cars. And even though those contests that my students were entering are now, they typically include what they think of as a practical class, and I use the air quotes for that. They're not practical. They're really not practical vehicles. Put your PV on your roof and on the grid and charge your car from the grid. The grid is how we act together as a community to optimize our capital expenses, our capital utilization.
Thanks, Dave. That being said, I know that there's a company out there, and mobility is changing. So there's a company out there, Aptera, APTERA.com, and they're building a super efficient commuter car. And it's supposed to be available later this year. And they are claiming that you can charge with panels on the vehicle for certain situations and perhaps your normal commute. So I want to move on to another subject, Dave, so we can.
I want to push back on that. Again, it's expensive. Solar panels are not free, and putting them on a car is the wrong place for them. And a lot of the quotes, not just Aptera, but a lot of other people, are somewhat overblown. If you want a Swiss Army knife, I have another slide for this. People are fascinated with Swiss Army knives, right? The one tool that does a whole lot of things. Swiss Army knives are great knives. I have a 35-year-old Swiss Army knife that's still razor sharp, and I've never sharpened it. But the screwdriver, if I need a screwdriver, I don't really want to use that one. I only use that screwdriver if it's the thing I have to use. Same thing with the scissors, same thing with the tweezers, same thing with those. Dedicated tools have a real value, and people have a tendency to play fast and loose with data. If you really want a Swiss Army knife, build a solar carport. get some shade with your energy so that when you go out to the car and you open the door, you don't have to do the Texas pause while the blast furnace comes out at you and the interior of the car cools off a little bit.
Right. Dave, you mentioned your license plate was SOLR car. And a number of, yes, okay, a number of us have license plates that tell people something's different here. They make them think, and what does this thing mean? And then they notice. So I know it has been a stimulation starter for many of us who've been in this for a little while. And I guess what I'm going to encourage is that the question really was, what else did you consider for your license plate? But I think that's, I'm just going to put this out to the group. If you have a special license plate that you've put on there that helps you do the same thing, put that in the chat, please, for everyone, so that we can see some of those comments as Dave gets on to the next question. Next question is about battery storage. Does battery storage add to the mix in a good way, and/or can you comment on a grid-tied EV, which we're not at the point where technology is there yet. So perhaps that one we should just defer till next year's deed presentation.
Well, funny you mentioned that, because that's the other slide that I eliminated from the 35-minute thing in order to meet the time frame. That's actually my first Swiss Army knife slide. I'm amazed. I've been at the solar part of this, the alternative energy part of this, since high school years, a long time ago, and so I'm very aware when the conversation changes. And it's been really interesting to me that just in the last 2 to 3 years, the solar conversation started almost reflexively including battery storage. People would say, oh, I want a Tesla Powerwall, or I got to have batteries with this system. And I'd really like to discourage that notion. There are legitimate reasons to put batteries in the system, certainly, but most of those reasons would be best served if we would put the batteries at the level of the grid, mainly in the distribution network, some of it at the transmission level, but the customer level at individual houses is really not the right place for most of the functions that it would serve. Again, the grid allows us to combine resources and optimize our capital utilization. The second reason I'd like to really discourage thinking about batteries is, other than the batteries in your car, is that batteries don't generate electricity, they consume it. If you put 100 kilowatt hours of energy into your battery, you'll probably get back out of it about 85 kilowatt hours. There's about a 15% loss in charging and discharging the battery. So that means that you're going to, in energy terms, you're going to have to put enough extra solar panels beyond that in order to make up that loss of having stored the energy in the first place. You'd really like to consume the energy as you generate it rather than store it for later. Now, that said, there are legitimate reasons to put batteries in your house, but my suggestion to anybody who hasn't really thought a lot about it is go in with the prejudice that batteries are bad, and then only change that prejudice if you can convince yourself in quantitative terms, in dollars, in kilowatt hours, in hours of energy blackout avoided, in some way that you can actually put a number on. If you can't put that number on it, just think in terms of, I'm not going to have batteries, and only change your mind on that if you can put that number on. And part of the reason for saying that is, it used to be that we put batteries in like off-grid systems. We would put a lot of batteries in them because batteries were cheaper than solar panels. It's the opposite right now. Solar panels are really cheap, but batteries are still expensive. And so you'll get a lot more environmental bang for your buck if you invest in generation rather than storage.
Okay.
Back to, and V2G, the grid, the car grid connection. Again, in the last couple of years, the conversation has changed, and everybody thinks they need battery storage. And I know every solar installer I know is getting constantly bombarded with requests for battery storage. And there have been reasons to not do it with cars, but the flip side of that is the car is a big honking battery on wheels. And so the functionality to feed the grid, to be an emergency power supply, that sort of thing, or to feed not necessarily the grid, but to throw a switch and take your house off grid and just power the essential loads in your house, is actually built in, engineered into a lot of cars, but it's not sold in the US because we have a very brutal product liability law environment. And so the legal environment here does not lend itself to car manufacturers allowing you to use that capability. Volkswagen recently announced that they are going to put that capability in every car, every EV they sell, and that's going to be a game changer. It's got the world abuzz with the possibilities of using your battery as like an emergency generator. Think about one thing about this. You have an area, like if you live in a rural area that gets a lot of long power outages, the beauty of a car is you can drive it to a place that doesn't have an outage, charge it, and take it home, take the energy home with you. So it's a great feature. It's just going to be a little slow getting to the US because of our product liability environment.
Some people have had to leave, and I want to make sure people know that this is being recorded, and that the recording is going to be on probably two places. One is the Blue Ridge EV Club YouTube channel, and the second place, I know it'll be there because I'll put it there. Second place is, I believe, the Deed website. You can go to this event, after this event, and probably within a day or two, they will upload, or I will upload to them the recording. So you'll have access to this. And Dave put his slide up before about his contact information. He's willing to talk to people. Here's one, Dave, for you. I have 26 solar panels, and at the end of the year, I'm basically net zero. So that's the situation. 2 years ago, I bought a Bolt and loving driving electric. I'm debating whether adding more solar is worth the investment. I assume he means that for the additional demand that he's put on with his electric cars. And is it worth the investment with the decrease in solar incentives, especially since you can't really take this power with you on the road? Are you got thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do. I'm in a situation here where this past year with the pandemic, this is just speaking personally, with the pandemic, my wife and I have driven less than the amount of extra solar beyond our house consumption would require. So this past year with the pandemic, we've been at net zero. I want to travel. That's the reason I bought the long range car. And so when I'm driving that car, I'm going to be away from home. And so I can't use directly the output from my panels, and Duke Energy's compensation structure basically confiscates anything that's left over at the end of May. And so I have no way of getting compensated if I were to add panels to my house. But this, to me, is more than a financial discussion. It's to me, there's a moral dimension to it, and part of my own personal motivation for doing this is really unrelated to finance. So I would like to be net zero, but I don't want to make a donation to Duke Energy, or at least I don't mind making a little donation to them. But so my strategy is I have not done this yet, but I intend to approach some nonprofits and say, would you like solar on your roof, and help them have enough solar on their roof that it would compensate for my driving consumption and do them some financial good too. Because right now I could walk my talk morally, but I'd just be making. But if I do it at my house, I would just be making a donation to Duke Energy, and I'm a Duke Energy shareholder, but I'm not going to get that much return on that investment.
Dave, if is this feasible? Is putting solar panels on your roof feasible with an east-west roof alignment, or maybe you would recommend a ground mount? Could you comment?
That's the place where PV watts really comes in handy. That NREL calculator that I showed you with a URL for it. Let me go back to that particular one. Where is that? Right here. Or no, not right here. It's here.
I gotta say this. This Bud's for you, or this is for you, Bud. Bud is the guy who asked this question. One of our neighbors.
Yeah. So the PV watts calculator will help you answer that question. I can't off the top of my head answer that question, but PV watts and Bud, I'd be happy to help you with it. If you want a little guidance on what to put into PV watts, but it looks at any orientation you can come up with. You tell it the way your system is going to be oriented, and it'll tell you what the output is. So you can then make the decision of whether that's financially desirable.
Okay, Dave, can you give me back control of the screen? I wanted to show something else here.
Sure.
And also, I guess I'll mention, let's see if this is the, find it here.
While you're finding that, I notice in the group chat, the chat to everyone, that Vern is asking about Northeastern Ohio. I lived in Columbus for 11 years, and I realize Cleveland's a little different, but it would surprise you how much solar there is even up there. Asheville only gets about 15% more sunshine in the course of a year than Columbus did. Columbus does.
Well, I wanted to show that I was going to have a few other photos of other places where you can charge by solar, and that would be away from home. And some places, sometimes stores have those above arrays, especially in California, some of the sunnier climates. EVgo is powered entirely by renewable energy. So give those some thought when you say, I really like this idea. I'm drooling for solar on my house, but I can still get it elsewhere. In Buncombe County, where we are in North Carolina, there's also a solar crowdsource. Our county has made a commitment to renew 100% renewable energy by a certain date, and I don't know that off top, but they're basically putting together a package with lots of consumers in our area, and you can get on that now, and then you can get a lower rate and benefits that way. So. I think wherever area you have, I guess here's another comment here on Wisconsin, growsolar.org. Eau Claire, I think our current political environment and the fact that our legislators are all having conversations about what is this the right thing to do or what should we do about climate and our infrastructure is going to mean that our voices are going to be heard and people will be looking for us. So places like Electric Auto Association that our Blue Ridge EV Club is a chapter of, the Solar Alliance, Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, Plug in America, those will all be places that these legislators will go to and will actually do some lobbying for us. They're nonprofits. A lot of these electric auto associations run by nobody's getting paid to do this. We have a passion for it. So those are, I think it's a good time right now. So
let me tag into that, Joe, if I could real quick. I'd really like to also remind people you have probably multiple local solar installers who do really good work, and they're your neighbors. They're paying taxes that support the same schools that your kids go to. And so even if you join in with these bigger programs, give your local installers a chance to compete with them too.
Okay, great. Well, I'm going to take this chance to thank Dave again for participating. And we had a couple other members from our Blue Ridge EV Club, Bihari Singh, our president, and Jim Hardy, our treasurer, who are online. And I'm Joe Baum. I'm our secretary of the club. So look us up at 1 o'clock today. That's, I guess, in Eastern time. We got about another couple hours away. You can do a virtual ride and drive with Leilani Munter. And this is being sponsored by cleanenergy.org. Go to their event page and you'll find the links to get there. And again, use the Drive Electric Earth Day website to look at other Zoom broadcasts. That's, as far as I'm concerned, probably one of the only benefits of this pandemic is the fact that we are able to connect and get some information that we wouldn't be able to do otherwise. So thank you all for being part of this. We will put this on the Blue Ridge EV Club, the video, on our channel, YouTube channel, and also at the DEED website. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everybody. And please contact me. I'd love to hear from you.